I watched my mom burn my $2.5 million lottery check without stopping her. Crazy, right? But what if I told you? I planned every second of it. Stay with me because this story isn't just about money, it's about betrayal, boundaries, and the moment I took back control. Fiona had always been the kind of woman who made do with what she had. At 34, she lived in a modest one-bedroom apartment on the edge of town tucked between a laundromat and a flower shop that had seen better days. Her job as an administrative assistant at a dental clinic paid just enough to cover rent, groceries, and the occasional movie night when the budget allowed. Fiona wasn't unhappy, exactly. She was used to quiet evenings and counting pennies. But deep down, like a whisper that never quite died, she held on to the idea that one day anything might happen to finally make her feel seen. That Thursday started like any other. Fiona left work at 5:03 p.m., waved goodbye to the receptionist who never remembered her name, and stopped at the gas station 2 blocks from home. As she waited for the pump to click, her eyes wandered to the bright neon sign over the cashier window. Powerball jackpot, $2.5 million. She wasn't a lottery person, not really. But something about that day, the way the sun hung low like gold over the street, or maybe just the weariness in her bones, nudged her forward. "One quick pick," she said aloud, half to herself. The cashier smiled, handed her the ticket, and said, "Hey, lightning's got to strike somewhere, right?" Back at her apartment, Fiona reheated last night's soup and curled up on the couch with a worn throw blanket. She didn't even remember where she placed the ticket until the lottery numbers appeared on the screen between news segments. She pulled the slip from her purse more out of habit than hope. The first number matched. Then the second. A third. Her spoon clattered to the floor. By the time all 6 numbers aligned, Fiona was on her feet staring at the screen like it had grown arms and was applauding her. She didn't scream, didn't cry. She just stood there, breath caught somewhere between disbelief and wonder. She reread the numbers, checked the ticket against the website, triple-checked it with a screenshot. "No way," she whispered over and over again, like the phrase could stop the earth from spinning too fast. The rest of the night passed in a fog. She put the ticket in a plastic sandwich bag, then tucked it inside a hardcover copy of Pride and Prejudice on her bookshelf, the safest place she could think of. She texted Rachel, her best friend since college, "Can you come over? Emergency." But a good one. When Rachel arrived, Fiona simply held up the ticket. "I think I just won the lottery," she said. Rachel's eyes widened, mouth dropped. "Are you serious?" she asked, grabbing Fiona's phone and pulling up the official numbers. When they matched, she let out a long, slow whistle. "Girl, you just became a millionaire." Even as Rachel celebrated with wild whoops and half-sobbing laughter, Fiona remained oddly still. A calm had settled over her, shocking in its clarity. The world hadn't changed yet. The rent was still due. Her chipped mug still sat in the sink, but something invisible had cracked open possibility. As they stayed up late talking through the logistics, how to claim the prize, whether to go lump sum or annuity, how to find a financial advisor, Fiona couldn't help but think of her family. Her parents. Her younger sister Brooke. The golden child. Brooke, who got ballet classes and birthday trips while Fiona learned to bake her own cakes. Brooke, who got rescued from bad boyfriends and failed business ideas while Fiona worked 2 jobs through community college. She thought about the look on her mother's face when Fiona once mentioned applying for a promotion. "Do you really think you're management material, sweetheart?" she had said, laughing like Fiona had told a joke. That laugh had echoed in Fiona's ears for years, and now with this absurd slip of paper, no longer than a grocery receipt, she had something no one could ignore. Something they couldn't minimize. "I used to dream," she told Rachel that night, her voice soft but steady, "that maybe something wild would happen just once so they'd have to see me. Not as a backup plan, not as a shadow, but as someone real." Rachel reached across the couch and squeezed her hand. "Well, they're about to get a show they never saw coming." As Fiona drifted off to sleep that night for the first time in years, she didn't dream of being somewhere else or someone else. She dreamt of standing in her truth with or without applause. Lying in bed later that night, Fiona stared at the ceiling, the shadows of the window blinds casting soft lines across the room. She remembered being 12, sitting at the dinner table with a crayon-drawn Mother's Day card in her hand waiting to give it to her mom. Brooke had just handed over a glittery art project their teacher helped assemble, and her mother had swooned with delight, kissing Brooke's forehead and declaring it a masterpiece. Fiona's card sat unopened next to her plate until her father said, "Oh, is that from you too?" No one ever said it was bad. They just forgot it existed. That moment, small, ordinary, unintentional, had wrapped itself around her ribcage for years. It was never about grand betrayals, she realized, but about being consistently invisible in the spaces that should have seen her most clearly. Tonight, holding that lottery ticket, Fiona felt the weight begin to shift. Not because the money validated her worth, but because for the first time the universe had whispered directly to her. "You matter." Not because she gave. Not because she smiled quietly, but simply because she was. Fiona had imagined this moment 100 times: the unveiling of her news at the family dinner table, their eyes widening, her mother, perhaps dropping a fork in disbelief. Her father standing to clap her on the back in rare approval. In those daydreams, her sister Brooke would be gracious for once, maybe even a little humbled, but reality has always had its own script. Sunday dinners were a tradition in the Wallace household, though for Fiona they had long become rituals of invisibility. The table, though wide, always seemed to shrink when it came to making room for her voice. Still, she arrived early that evening out of both habit and a flicker of hope that maybe for once it would be different. She helped her mother in the kitchen, slicing carrots and arranging place settings, the lottery ticket folded in her wallet like a secret burning through the leather. Her heart thudded in her chest, a strange mix of nerves and defiance. "You're humming," her mother remarked absently while seasoning the roast. "That's unusual." Fiona smiled, brushing off the comment. "Had a good week." They made small talk until the others arrived, her father punctual as ever, and Brooke fashionably late in a silk blouse that likely cost more than Fiona's monthly rent. Once they settled at the table and the usual pleasantries dissolved into the clatter of silverware, Fiona took a breath and spoke. "I have some news," she said, trying to keep her voice even. "I won the lottery. $2.5 million. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of chewing. Then her mother gasped and clutched Fiona's hand. "Oh my God, sweetheart, that's incredible." Her father let out a sharp whistle. "Well, would you look at that?" Even Brooke seemed momentarily stunned. "Seriously, you wow." Fiona allowed herself one breath of that rare air: recognition, surprise, even joy. But it evaporated faster than she expected. Her father leaned forward. "You know," he said, tapping his fork against his plate, "this could be perfect timing." Fiona's stomach sank. For what she asked, though, she already knew. Brooke shifted uncomfortably. "Dad." He continued anyway. "Brooke's business, her boutique, has been struggling a bit. Not her fault, just the economy. But with a little help, she could really turn it around." Her mother nodded enthusiastically. "She's got such a great vision, Fiona. She just needs a bit of capital to get her footing again." Fiona blinked. "I just told you I won the lottery and you're already asking for a bailout." Brooke raised her hands in mock innocence. "It's not like I'm asking for half, maybe just enough to clear my debt and boost marketing. $80. Oh, zero would do it." $80,000, Fiona repeated. "That's not a small favor." Her father frowned. "It's family." "Is it?" Fiona said, setting her fork down. "Because I've been in debt for 10 years and no one passed the hat around for me." Her mother's face tightened. "That's not fair. We've always tried to support you both equally." Fiona laughed, quiet, bitter. "No, you supported Brooke. I managed myself. And now that something finally good happens to me, I'm supposed to hand it over because she failed again." Brooke looked wounded. "You don't have to be nasty about it." "I'm not being nasty," Fiona said. "I'm being honest. Every time she stumbles, someone cushions the fall. You never asked what I'd do with the money. You just assumed I'd give it away." Her father sighed, disappointed. "You've always been so independent, Fiona. I thought you'd understand that family means lifting each other up." "No," Fiona replied, her voice sharpening. "You thought I'd keep lifting while she kept climbing." The room fell quiet. Her mother blinked rapidly. Brooke's face hardened. Fiona stood her chair, scraping softly against the floor. This isn't about money. It's about always being the second thought. The after plan. The responsible one who doesn't need praise or support because she'll figure it out. Well, I did. And now that I have you want a piece. She looked each of them in the eye. For once, I want to be the one who doesn't have to explain herself. Who doesn't have to justify needing or wanting something just for me. She walked to the door, her voice low, but steady. I'm not a checkbook. I'm not a fixer. I'm your daughter. And tonight I finally know my place at this table outside it. She left without another word, her footsteps calm, her heart breaking, but also rebuilding itself in the silence that followed. Fiona thought maybe the tension would die down after that Sunday dinner. Maybe the message would sink in that her money was hers and she wasn't an extension of someone else's emergency plan. But by the following morning, her phone was already ringing at 7:30 a.m. A call from her mother that began without so much as a hello. I've been thinking, her mother said, her tone clipped like someone correcting a child. You must have been overwhelmed last night. That's understandable. But I hope now that you've had time to reflect, you realize how important it is to support your sister. You're in a unique position to change her life. Fiona stayed silent for a beat, then said simply, I'm not giving Brooke anything, and ended the call before she could hear the inevitable gasp of disapproval. Later that day, a text came in from her father. We're organizing a family meeting to discuss the plan. Sunday, 6 p.m. Don't be late. Fiona laughed out loud. Not a chuckle, but a disbelieving dry laugh that left her feeling hollow. A family meeting. As if this was a company and she was the CFO who had to report to a board of directors. She typed a quick reply. I won't be attending. My financial decisions are mine alone. No response. But at exactly 5:58 p.m. that Sunday, her phone rang again, a video call from her father. She let it ring. Then another from Brooke. Then a long text thread from her mother filled with veiled guilt and short phrases meant to pierce. We raised you better. Family helps family. You're not thinking clearly. Fiona didn't reply. She turned off her notifications and took a long silent walk instead. Each step felt like stepping further away from something rotten, something tangled in years of polite silence and emotional neglect. She realized the moment she said no, she became the villain. Not because she had changed, but because she had stopped playing the role they wrote for her. 2 days later, the guilt campaign escalated. Her aunt called her, clearly coached by her parents, and began the conversation with, Sweetheart, I know this is a confusing time for you. Confusing? No, Fiona thought. What's confusing is the fact that no one had asked her a single question since she'd won. Not how she was feeling or whether she needed help navigating the legal side of things. Not if she felt safe or overwhelmed or scared. Just, can we have some? She wanted to scream, why has no one asked if I'm tired? Because she was. Tired of being the good one. The strong one. The dependable daughter who could be ignored for years and then expected to fund someone else's rescue mission without hesitation. She wanted someone to ask, are you okay? Not, can you write a check? Instead, what she got was a scheduled intervention. Her mother texted again that weekend. We'll all be at the house Sunday at 4 p.m. You should come. We've created a draft proposal for how the money could be best allocated. It's very fair. Your sister spent a lot of time on it. Fiona's fingers hovered over the reply. Then she typed, this isn't a group project. My life is not up for allocation. And still they didn't stop. Brooke sent an emotional voice memo. Her tone was syrupy, sweet, but the words stung. I know you're feeling overwhelmed, but this isn't just about you, Fiona. We're a family, and honestly, if I had won, I wouldn't have hesitated for a second to help you. Fiona remembered Brooke's Bali trip with her $10,000 inheritance. Not a single offer to cover lunch, let alone share the windfall. The hypocrisy was stunning. Eventually, Fiona stopped taking calls altogether. She met with her financial advisor instead, someone who specialized in sudden wealth. Miss Torres, sharp and calm, laid out clear boundaries like a lifeline. People often feel entitled to what they didn't earn. Your only responsibility is to yourself. Set clear lines, and stick to them. Fiona began to breathe again. She started journaling, taking long walks, drinking coffee alone in her kitchen while the morning sun touched her cheeks like something gentle for once. And she made a list not of people to give money to, but of things she had gone without therapy she couldn't afford. The weekend course in design she once dreamed of. A decent mattress. Time, silence, peace. When she thought about what the lottery had given her, it wasn't just numbers in a bank account. It was the ability to stop apologizing for existing. It was the audacity to say no and mean it. It was the power to build a life without asking for permission. As Fiona walked through the quiet neighborhood one evening, she felt the weight of memories pressing in on her like thick humidity. Every step echoed with unspoken history, years of being overlooked, of being the background character in her own life story. She passed by the elementary school where she'd once won a district-wide essay competition. She remembered clutching the certificate with pride, rushing home to show her parents only to find them beaming at Brooke's new painting on the fridge. "You wrote something." "That's nice," her mother had said, not even lifting her eyes. Fiona had smiled tightly and tucked the certificate into her desk drawer. It stayed there for years. That memory, long buried, rose now like an old bruise pressed too hard. It wasn't about the money. It never was. It was about not being seen. Not being chosen. Not once, not even by accident. She paused at a bench near the community garden and sat down, pulling her coat tighter around her. Her phone buzzed in her pocket again. Another message, this one from Brooke. A photo of them as kids, arms around each other, both grinning, Brooke missing a front tooth, Fiona with scraped knees and gap-toothed laughter. Underneath the message, "Remember when we were best friends? I don't know what happened to us, but I miss you, and I hope we can figure this out. Love you." It was almost touching. But even now the image was carefully curated, strategically timed. Fiona could feel the strings behind the words. She knew this tactic well, emotional disarmament disguised as nostalgia. Still her heart ached. Because yes, they had once been close. Before the hierarchy had been carved in stone. Before she learned that proximity didn't mean priority. She opened her notes app and began typing, not a reply but something for herself. A letter she'd never send. "Dear Brooke, I do remember. I remember believing you were my best friend. I remember believing that maybe one day I would matter to Mom and Dad the way you did. That if I worked hard enough, stayed quiet enough, helped often enough, I would earn it. But that day never came. And now that I've said no once, you all act like I've committed treason. You call me selfish. But where was your concern when I was working double shifts to pay off student loans? Where was the family meeting when I had no heat in winter because I couldn't afford the bill? You want a part of something I've finally been given after a lifetime of being invisible. And you don't ask how I am. You ask how much I'll give. That's what hurts the most. Fiona." She stared at the screen for a long time before locking her phone. She wouldn't send it. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But it felt good to write it. To put it down. Her truth didn't need their approval to exist. And for the first time in years, Fiona felt like she was starting to reclaim her own voice. Not the people-pleaser, not the peacemaker, but the woman who finally understood that love without respect is a chain, not a gift. As she stood up from the bench, Fiona whispered under her breath, "Not my responsibility," and let the words settle in her bones like a quiet, powerful vow. Fiona stood at the threshold of her apartment and immediately knew something was off. The door was locked as it always was, but the air felt wrong. Like silence had been disturbed and stitched back together too quickly. She stepped inside, cautiously, her senses alert, and then she heard them, low voices coming from the living room. Her stomach turned. She dropped her bag by the door and moved quietly toward the sound. And there they were. Her mother and father. Standing over her coffee table, a small metal bin between them. Flames flickered inside it. "What the hell?" She started, rushing forward. Her mother looked up, startled, and took a step back. Her father didn't flinch. "It had to be done," he said, as if it was the most natural thing in the world to break into your daughter's apartment and set fire to her property. The smell of burnt paper was thick in the room. Fiona stared at the charred remains in the bin. It was the oversized lottery check, the ceremonial photo prop from the announcement day. The one she tucked into a drawer like a keepsake. "You burned the check?" she asked, blinking, almost amused. It's for your own good, her mother cut in, eyes wide with misplaced righteousness. You are being unreasonable. This forces a reset. Fiona let out a small breath, almost a laugh. Not because it was funny, but because it was insane. You broke into my home, she said calmly, voice like tempered glass. You used the spare key I gave you 3 years ago when I had the flu. You never returned it. It's still our family, her father said, as if that justified the trespassing. And we had to intervene. You weren't thinking clearly. The money has gone to your head. Fiona shook her head slowly. You think that check was the real payout? She asked, lips curling into something between a smile and a smirk. You really believed you could destroy my claim by burning a souvenir? For the first time, doubt flickered in her father's eyes. Her mother frowned. What do you mean it's just a prop? Fiona said coolly. A fake. For the press. The real money has already been wired into a secure account. With 2-step verification and physical ID protocols. You destroyed a piece of cardboard. The color drained from her mother's face. Her father's mouth opened slightly as if searching for a retort but finding none. Fiona didn't move. She didn't shout, she didn't cry. She stood still in the center of the room, calm as ice, letting the weight of their failure settle into the silence. I'm calling the locksmith today, she said after a pause. You're never getting into this apartment again. Not with a key, not with guilt. You're overreacting, her mother said quickly, desperation, replacing the confidence from moments earlier. This is just a misunderstanding. No, Fiona said, voice firm but quiet. This is clarity. You didn't burn the check because you were confused. You did it because you thought if you could destroy the symbol you could control me. Her father took a step forward. You always were dramatic. Fiona met his gaze. And you always were entitled. The words hung in the air like frost. Brooke appeared in the doorway, seconds later carrying takeout. Oh, she said, freezing mid-step. You're home. Apparently I should have expected guests, Fiona replied without looking away from her parents. They broke in. They burned the ceremonial check. Thought it was real. Brooke's eyes widened. I didn't know they were going to do that, she said quickly. They told me we were just going to talk to you again. You were all complicit, Fiona said, finally turning to her sister. Maybe not in action, but in assumption. You all thought this was negotiable. She walked slowly toward the door and held it open. Get out. Her mother opened her mouth to protest. Fiona raised a hand. Leave now or I file a police report for breaking and entering. And I will press charges. Her parents hesitated only for a second, but the look in Fiona's eyes was not one they'd ever seen before. They gathered their coats in silence. Brooke paused in the doorway, guilt in her expression. You're being cruel, she said. Fiona answered without hesitation. Cruel as walking into someone's home uninvited and trying to burn down their future. This is me finally choosing myself. When the door shut behind them, Fiona locked it, both the knob and the deadbolt. Then she leaned back against it, feeling the tremble in her spine begin to fade. Her hands were steady, her breath slow. She walked over to the burnt remains, took a photo for documentation, then opened a window to let the smoke out. The air was sharp with ash and betrayal, but also strangely clear. That night, she called her lawyer, then her bank, then the building security. She scheduled the locks to be changed, ordered a new intercom code, and added her unit to the no visitor access list. By morning, her world was secure again, and for the first time in years, so was she. Fiona didn't change her number, but she stopped answering. She didn't block them. She wanted to know what was being said, but she no longer felt compelled to respond. Every new message from her parents or Brooke only confirmed what she had finally begun to understand: their concern was conditional, their love tied to usefulness. She wasn't a daughter in their eyes, she was a resource. So, she did the one thing she had always been afraid to do: she cut the cord. She didn't send a dramatic announcement, she simply fell silent. And then she began to build. The next morning, she contacted the attorney her financial advisor had recommended, a woman named Miss Hartley, who specialized in wealth protection and family legal conflict. Fiona explained everything in detail, from the lottery win to the break-in and the burned check. Hartley listened without interrupting, only occasionally scribbling notes. When Fiona finished, she leaned back and said with quiet conviction, "You've made the right call. Let's put your financial and legal safety net in place, and let's stop worrying about what people think." Fiona exhaled slowly. That was the first time in weeks someone had said those words to her without judgment. She set up everything: estate planning, a revocable trust, layers of security, and most importantly, a cease and desist letter that would be drafted and ready to send if the harassment escalated. "Don't send it yet," Hartley advised, "but keep it close. Your silence is powerful, but it's not weakness." That same day, Fiona also signed up for a series of workshops: financial literacy, investing for women, and On Impulse, a weekend course on negotiation and boundary setting. Not because she didn't know how, but because she needed to rebuild the muscle of choosing herself. By week's end, she'd also seen a therapist for the first time in over a decade. "I don't want to be angry," she said, clutching a tissue in her lap. "I just want to be free." The therapist smiled kindly. "Freedom isn't the absence of anger, it's knowing you don't owe anyone your peace." But as Fiona quietly rebuilt, her family declared war. Not through lawyers or lawsuits, but through whispers. It started with a message from a distant cousin, then an aunt, then a former family friend, all saying some version of "We heard what happened. Is everything okay?" Fiona would reply with a simple "I'm fine, thank you," but the pattern became obvious. Her parents were painting her as unstable. The narrative had shifted. She was no longer the ungrateful daughter who refused to help. Now she was the poor girl who cracked under pressure. Her mother had told at least 3 relatives that Fiona was not herself lately. One even mentioned the words "mental break." It was absurd, and it hurt in a way she hadn't anticipated. It wasn't the lies that stung, it was the ease with which people believed them. The subtle erasure of her side of the story. The gaslighting on a family scale. She had expected backlash, yes, but the social isolation that followed was chilling. Invitations stopped coming. Text threads went silent. One former friend even unfollowed her online, as if choosing not to give away her winnings made her contagious. At night, Fiona lay awake in her new apartment, hearing the hum of the city outside her window, and wondering, was it always this quiet, or had she just never let herself be still before? She was lonely, but it wasn't the kind of loneliness that came from absence. It was the kind that followed clarity. That silent moment after the curtain is pulled back and you see everyone for who they really are. But she didn't regret it. Not 1 second. She'd spent 3 decades contorting herself to fit into rooms where she was barely tolerated. Now she was building her own room. With locked doors, and velvet couches, and no chairs for guilt. One afternoon, as she sipped her coffee on the balcony, her inbox pinged. It was from a former teacher, Miss Jennings, her AP English instructor from high school. They'd kept in loose contact over the years. The email was short: "I saw the news online. I just want to say good for you. Protecting yourself doesn't make you the villain. Some of us are quietly cheering for you. Stay strong, Fiona." She read it 3 times, her eyes welling. Because even a single voice saying "I see you" can drown out 1,000 that say you've changed, so she kept going. She hired a personal trainer, not for the body but for the discipline. She signed up for cooking classes not to impress anyone but because she'd always wanted to. She began volunteering with a nonprofit that helped women leaving abusive households start over financially. Each step was like laying bricks in a home that finally belonged to her. Not physically, but emotionally. And slowly the shame faded. The doubt loosened. The old reflexes of people-pleasing softened, replaced by something steadier. A sense of worth that didn't need to be proven. She wasn't cold. She wasn't cruel. She was just finally not available for being used. And if that made her a villain in someone else's story, so be it. She was done being the side character in her own. Fiona moved out without telling a soul. No forwarding address. No goodbye. She found a new apartment across town, modest, modern, quiet, with security cameras in the hallway and a 24-hour doorman who didn't ask questions. She changed her number, closed her old email, and deactivated every social media account she'd ever used. Not because she was afraid. Because she wanted peace. She wasn't hiding, she was protecting what she'd rebuilt. What she now knew she deserved. She kept the curtains drawn for weeks. She let herself sleep in without guilt, cook meals that had no audience, read books she had forgotten she'd wanted to read. The silence that once scared her now felt sacred. A soft, steady background for a life no longer dictated by obligation. One morning, as light pooled onto her kitchen counter, she opened her laptop and typed "female financial advisors near me." The search yielded dozens of results, but one name stood out: Margot Lee. Young Asian American background in nonprofit finance and glowing reviews from other women who praised her clarity and integrity. Fiona made the appointment, heart oddly fluttering. It felt like a date with her future. Margot was sharp and unpretentious. She didn't talk down to Fiona, didn't assume she wanted luxury or status. "What do you want this money to do for you?" she asked in their first meeting, pen poised but eyes steady. Fiona paused. "I want it to keep me safe," she said finally, "and I want it to matter." Margot smiled. "Then we'll start with those two goals." Together they built a plan. Fiona paid off the rest of her student loans and set aside enough in an emergency fund to breathe without panic for the next 5 years. They created diversified investment portfolios, quiet, conservative, low risk. "We'll grow it like a tree, not fireworks," Margot explained. And Fiona nodded. That was exactly the kind of life she wanted now. At the same time, she started therapy with Dr. Serena Brooks, a warm, soft-voiced Black woman who spoke with the authority of someone who had seen generational pain and helped women climb out of it. "Your family taught you your worth was tied to what you gave," Dr. Brooks said during their second session. "But love isn't a transaction. It's a resting place. You've been trying to earn your right to exist. Now you're unlearning that." Fiona cried more than she expected. But with each tear, something loosened. A lifetime of tightness she hadn't known she'd been holding. By the third month in her new life, Fiona did something unexpected. She bought a whiteboard. She mounted it in her kitchen and wrote in big capital letters, "Freedom is my first investment." Underneath, she began listing ideas. Not for businesses, for impact. What could she do with this windfall that didn't just serve her but planted something for others? And that's how the idea began. A small education fund for women between the ages of 18 and 30 focused on financial literacy and autonomy. She remembered being that girl working late nights Googling what is compound interest on her cracked phone, too afraid to ask anyone because the world had already assumed she should know. No one had ever explained it. Just like no one had ever explained how to say no or how to protect your boundaries when they're called selfish, the foundation wasn't flashy. There was no gala, no press release. Just a simple website built with a template and filled with her own words. "We believe every woman deserves the right to understand her money, trust her gut, and walk away when something doesn't feel right. This fund is for the woman who's been taught to apologize before she speaks. We're here to say you don't owe them everything. You owe yourself a life." She funded the first year entirely by herself and began partnering with community colleges, libraries, and women's shelters. The workshops were small, 8 to 12 women in folding chairs eating granola bars and nodding silently as the facilitator explained credit scores, debt traps, and salary negotiations. Fiona attended the first one in the back row. She didn't speak, she just watched. One girl, barely 19, raised her hand and asked, "So, it's not normal for my boyfriend to take my paycheck?" Fiona swallowed the lump in her throat. That was why she was doing this. She wasn't rich to buy a Tesla. She was rich to make sure that girl never had to ask permission to leave. She began journaling again, something she hadn't done since college. In one entry she wrote, "I used to think freedom looked like a penthouse and a first-class ticket. Now I know it looks like leaving a job without begging. Like saying no to a family gathering that makes you shrink. Like not explaining your choices to people who never listened." The press never found her. Her family, at least for now, had stopped trying. Maybe they were embarrassed. Maybe they had moved on to spinning a new version of the story. Maybe they were just waiting. But Fiona no longer lived in anticipation of their next move. She was busy. She was learning to bake bread, taking long walks, trying watercolor, discovering that she liked instrumental jazz and hated folding laundry and preferred black coffee over lattes after all. She was slowly, steadily rediscovering who she had been before the expectations settled over her like wet wool. She didn't need to forgive anyone right now. She didn't need to make peace with people who still believed she owed them something. What she needed, what she was giving herself, was the quiet joy of not being needed by anyone who didn't see her, and that she realized was the greatest wealth of all. Fiona hadn't thought about Brooke in weeks. Not deeply. Not in the old aching way. There were flickers when she saw a woman in a pink scarf like the one Brooke used to wear, or when a certain song played that reminded her of summer drives with the windows down, but they passed like shadows across her peace. She didn't miss the drama. She didn't miss the manipulation. But sometimes in the quiet of her new apartment, she wondered what it would have been like to have a sister who saw her. Really saw her. So when she opened her inbox one Thursday morning and saw the subject line from Brooke, her breath caught just slightly. The message preview read, "You don't have to read this, but I hope you will." She hesitated. Her thumb hovered over the screen. Then she tapped. The email wasn't long. No dramatic paragraphs, no tears in text form. Just honesty. "Fiona, I know I'm the last person you want to hear from. I've been thinking about everything about who I've been. About how I've taken so much for granted. I'm not writing to ask you for anything. I just need to tell you something. I didn't understand you. Not really. I thought you were cold, detached, distant. I didn't see what it felt like to always be the one who stayed quiet, who gave in, who didn't get asked what she wanted. I didn't see how lonely that must have been. I don't expect anything from this. I just wanted to say I'm sorry. And I hope maybe someday we can talk again." Fiona stared at the screen, the cursor blinking like a metronome in her pulse. She reread the message 3 times. There was no manipulation, no guilt-tripping, no subtle demand, just an apology. It didn't undo anything. It didn't return the years lost to favoritism or erase the bitter dinners where Fiona's accomplishments were invisible beside Brooke's drama. But it was the first time in decades that Brooke had acknowledged the imbalance. Not with excuses. With humility. Fiona didn't cry, she didn't rage, she simply sat with it. Let it breathe. Let herself feel the tangle of reactions without trying to untangle them. Later that day, during her weekly therapy session, she read the email aloud to Dr. Brooks. "She says she's sorry," Fiona said, folding her hands in her lap. "And I think she means it. I don't know what to do with that." Dr. Brooks tilted her head thoughtfully. "What does your gut say?" "My gut says I'm not ready to respond. And that I don't owe her forgiveness just because she finally acknowledged the truth. But I also don't want to stay angry. I don't want to hold this forever." "That sounds like wisdom," Dr. Brooks said gently. "Forgiveness isn't a light switch. It's a boundary with grace." That night, Fiona lit a candle and poured a glass of wine. She sat on her balcony watching the city lights flicker like constellations. The email echoed in her mind, not as a demand, but as a door. One she didn't have to walk through yet, one she could simply leave ajar. She opened her journal and wrote, "Maybe I don't need to reopen the past to let it rest. Maybe I can honor the apology without erasing what I've learned." A week passed. Then, 2. Brooke didn't send another message. There were no follow-ups, no pressure. And somehow that made it easier to believe she was genuine. Fiona finally replied. The message was short. "Thank you for your email. I appreciate you reflecting on the past and acknowledging how it impacted me. I'm still processing everything and I need more time before I consider what a relationship between us might look like in the future. I wish you well in the meantime." She didn't sign it with love. She didn't promise anything, but she sent it with clarity and without malice. And when she hit send, she felt no guilt. No regret. Just a strange, quiet pride. Because for the first time she was choosing something for herself that didn't require burning bridges or rebuilding them. She was simply walking her own path. With her values intact. She didn't tell anyone about the email, not even Rachel. It felt private, sacred in its own way. A reminder that healing didn't always have to be loud. Sometimes it was a soft shift inside the decision to release resentment without forgetting the reason it existed. In the weeks that followed, Fiona threw herself into her foundation work. She visited a high school to speak on budgeting and student loans. She met with a single mom who wanted to learn how to open a savings account. She listened. She taught. She grew. And once at the end of a workshop, a young woman asked, "Have you ever forgiven someone who didn't deserve it?" Fiona paused. Then she smiled gently. "I don't think forgiveness is always about whether they deserve it," she said. "Sometimes it's about what you deserve. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can say is, 'I forgive you, but I still choose not to go back.'" The girl nodded slowly. Fiona felt something settle in her chest. She didn't need to go back to be free. She didn't need Brooke's approval, or her parents' remorse, or anyone's permission. She had her own compass now, and it pointed toward peace. The letter from the court arrived on a rainy Tuesday morning. Fiona almost didn't open it right away. She had learned to let anxiety pass through her like a wave rather than bracing against it. But curiosity won out. She sliced the envelope open with a letter opener shaped like a feather and read the first line slowly. "The court finds insufficient grounds to proceed with the civil claim. Case dismissed." There was no flourish, no drama. Just facts. Her parents had in a last-ditch effort tried to sue for financial coercion after realizing the lottery money had changed hands entirely without their benefit. They cited emotional distress, family betrayal, and even suggested that Fiona had promised them a portion, though no such promise had ever existed. But the court saw through it. There was no case, just entitlement. And with that it was over. Fiona folded the letter and slid it into a folder labeled closure. She made no calls. No social media posts, no triumphant texts. She didn't even tell Rachel until the weekend. It felt sacred, almost private, this clean ending. Not because it was satisfying in the cinematic sense, but because it gave her what she had truly needed all along, proof, not to them but to herself, that she had done nothing wrong. News traveled fast anyway. Within days, extended family members who had once sent veiled messages about keeping peace began to go silent. Her Aunt Helen, still her quiet supporter, texted to say, "Your parents are overwhelmed." Apparently they took out another loan to cover Brooke's latest shortfall. "She's defaulted on payments. It's not looking good." Fiona read it, then put her phone down. She didn't reply right away. She went for a walk instead. The city was beginning to bloom into early spring. Small tulips pushed through sidewalk planters. Children in rain boots stomped puddles on the edge of the park. Fiona moved slowly, deliberately, feeling the breeze on her skin. Not numb. Not triumphant. Just whole. At a bench under an old tree she sat and let herself think. There was no joy in their downfall. She felt no vindication watching the story of their deaths unfold from afar. If anything, there was grief, not for what they were going through now, but for what they had chosen to become. Her parents, who had once seemed like solid structures in her childhood, had revealed themselves to be houses built on sand. Their love had conditions. Their loyalty had strings. And their dignity had been gambled on control. But Fiona didn't want revenge. Not anymore. That part of her had burned out the day her mother dropped a match into a trash can full of false hope. What she wanted now was what she had fought for quietly, steadily, since the day she won the lottery: peace. Not silence born of defeat, but quiet earned through boundaries. She could have gone to the press. She could have aired every detail: the broken locks, the trespassing, the burned check, the manipulative texts. But she hadn't. And now she understood why, because telling the world wouldn't have changed her truth. And she no longer needed the world's validation. That evening she journaled one line that would stay with her for years. "I didn't win over them. I won over the version of me that would have begged to be loved anyway." Her days settled into calm. She had enrolled in a woodworking class, something she'd dreamed of since college but never had time or money to pursue. Her evenings were filled with quiet music and the smell of sawdust. Her mornings with emails from young women thanking her foundation for making financial literacy less scary, more human. One Friday, while sipping coffee on her balcony, she received a text from Brooke. "I heard the case got dismissed. I'm glad. You didn't deserve that." Fiona didn't reply. Not because she was angry, but because she didn't need to respond to every moment anymore. Some acknowledgments could float freely without needing a return. In therapy the following week, she reflected on that. I used to think silence was weakness, that not defending myself meant surrendering. But now, silence feels like choice. Like freedom. Dr. Brooks smiled. That's because it is. And so Fiona continued not with fireworks or grand declarations but with steady steps. She read. She wrote. She laughed more. She gave without being drained. She kept a list titled, What I Keep and What I Leave. Taped inside her closet under keep was peace, boundaries, purpose. Under leave was guilt, silence, and the need to prove her worth. She had not forgiven her parents in the traditional sense. She had not opened her heart to them again, but she had released the weight of needing them to understand. And in that release, she found something far more powerful than approval, clarity. She no longer needed to explain why she said no. She didn't crave their apology to feel whole. She didn't watch them fall to feel tall. Because Fiona had finally arrived at a place where her freedom wasn't a reaction, it was a direction. And that she realized was the only win that truly mattered. The dining table gleamed under the warm glow of the overhead lights, mahogany polished to a soft shine set with simple but elegant ceramic plates Fiona had picked out herself on a whim. There were fresh tulips in a narrow glass vase at the center, the same color as the blouse she wore that night, soft, blue, calm, and sure. In the kitchen, the scent of rosemary and roasted vegetables mingled with the faint citrus of the lemon tart cooling on the counter. It was the first dinner party Fiona had ever hosted in her own home, and she had chosen every guest deliberately. Rachel arrived first, carrying wine and laughing as she kicked off her shoes at the door. "You're really doing this," she said, pulling Fiona into a quick hug. "A real grown-up dinner party. Proud of you." Then came Sam, her friend from the financial literacy nonprofit, who had taught Fiona how to manage grants, and once cried when Fiona funded her little sister's scholarship. Next, there was Tanya from her woodworking class, whose hands were always covered in varnish, and whose stories of rebuilding her life post-divorce had inspired Fiona to keep showing up. Later, Aunt Helen appeared bearing a homemade pie and her signature dry humor. They didn't all know each other, not at first, but by the time the main course was served, laughter had filled the room like music. Stories flowed about terrible exes and impossible bosses, about small wins and quiet joys. At one point, Tanya clinked her glass and said, "This may sound weird, but this feels like Thanksgiving should have felt my whole life." Fiona smiled, not because it was perfect, but because it was real. She sat at the head of the table not out of ego, but because it was her table. Her space. Her rules. She looked around at the faces lit by candlelight and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: belonging. And not the kind you earn by conforming, pleasing, or sacrificing, but the kind you create by being wholly yourself and letting others meet you there. No one asked about money that night. No one suggested she owed anyone anything. No one compared her to her sister. They just passed the bread, refilled glasses, shared recipes and playlists, and asked questions like, "How are you sleeping lately?" and "What's one thing that's made you smile this week?" It was the kind of family Fiona hadn't known she needed. And as she stood later by the kitchen sink washing plates with Rachel and humming along to a quiet playlist, Fiona realized something else. Blood might tie people together, but it didn't guarantee safety, kindness, or support. Found family, chosen family did, and while she hadn't replaced her parents or her sister, she had redefined what love looked like. It was respect. It was space. It was effort given freely, not demanded. It was Rachel showing up with a bottle of wine. It was Sam texting midweek just to check in. It was Aunt Helen never pushing, only listening. It was Tanya saying, "I got you," when Fiona's car wouldn't start. For the first time in her life, Fiona didn't feel like she was fighting to be seen. She felt seen. Fully. As she was. And that kind of visibility. It didn't come from being needed or used or praised for what she could give. It came from being valued simply for being Fiona. As her guests trickled out, hugging her at the doorway, she promised this would become a tradition. No more trying to be part of someone else's table. From now on, she'd build her own, and only welcome those who knew how to sit without judgment. 1 year later, Fiona stood barefoot on the warm wood floors of her sunlit home, a cup of tea in her hands, and a quiet kind of joy in her chest. The kind that doesn't announce itself, just settles softly like dust on the windowsill of a life well tended. Outside the trees were blushing gold, a sure sign autumn had arrived. Inside, her new life had taken root not as a prize she won but as a garden she learned to grow slowly, deliberately, with trembling hands and unapologetic courage. Her home was modest, a one-story house tucked near the edge of a sleepy town by the lake, not far from where she grew up but a world away in spirit. It had taken months for her to feel safe again, to not look over her shoulder every time she walked to the mailbox, to trust silence instead of fearing what it hid. On her desk beneath a stack of grant proposals for her foundation sat a letter, handwritten, sealed, waiting. It was addressed simply to me, age 25. She had written it a week ago, but waited until today, her 35th birthday, to read it aloud. Alone but not lonely, she unfolded the paper and began. Dear Fiona, I know you're tired. I know you're wondering if trying so hard will ever be worth it. I know you're questioning whether being good, being quiet, being responsible will ever mean being loved. Here's what I want you to know. You will be okay. Even when no one claps. Even when no one notices. Even when the people you love the most turn their backs. You will survive the disappointment, the silence at the dinner table, the ache of always coming second. And one day, on a completely ordinary Tuesday, you will buy a lottery ticket, not for hope but for habit. And that moment, small as it seems, will be the beginning of everything changing. But this letter isn't about money. It's about who you'll become when no one's opinion can buy your loyalty anymore. You'll learn to walk away without slamming the door. You'll learn that saying no doesn't make you cruel, it makes you whole. You'll grieve the family you never really had. Then you'll build one that sees you truly. People who ask how you're sleeping. Who show up without needing a reason. Who sit at your table because they choose you, not because they expect something from you. There will be moments you'll want to scream, to set the record straight, to prove you were right all along. But you won't. Not because you're weak, but because your peace will matter more than being understood. You won't fix everything. But you'll stop needing to. You won't be everyone's daughter, everyone's sister, everyone's savior. But you'll finally be your own person. And trust me, she's worth knowing. With love from the other side of the fire, Fiona. She folded the letter and placed it in a wooden box labeled "Keep Only What Matters." The box also held a photo of her and her best friend Rachel hiking the cliffs of Oregon, a feather from a bird that had landed on her windowsill the day she received her first grant approval, and the small crumpled receipt from the gas station where she had bought the winning ticket. Each item a chapter. Each memory a mile walked away from who she had to be toward who she had chosen to become. She walked out onto her porch, the tea now lukewarm but still comforting, and watched the early morning unfold. A jogger passed by with a golden retriever, and the dog barked once as if in greeting. Across the street, an elderly couple sat reading newspapers in their rockers. None of them knew what she had gone through. None of them needed to. The story was hers now, not for proving, not for performing. Just for holding. Fiona had come to understand that some stories don't end with dramatic conclusions. Some just settle. They exhale. And in their stillness they become sacred. She no longer felt the need to explain to people why she had disappeared for a while, why her family was no longer part of her day-to-day life, or why she didn't post much online. Peace, she had learned, was private. The foundation she started had grown steadily. What began as a modest initiative to teach financial literacy to women aged 18 to 30 had expanded into a multi-state nonprofit with partnerships at community colleges and shelters. Fiona attended many of the sessions herself, not as a speaker but as a listener. Sometimes after class, a woman would approach her and say, "I thought I was the only one," and Fiona would smile and say, "You never were." She had come to believe that healing didn't always require loud declarations. Sometimes it just required being in a room with someone who saw you. As the wind picked up, a leaf danced down from the oak tree and landed near her foot. She picked it up, twirled it between her fingers, and thought of the seasons, how they change without asking permission. How they return. How even after the darkest winters, something green dares to push through. Later that afternoon, she met Rachel for lunch. They sat at a cafe by the marina, their usual spot. After catching up on work and life, Rachel looked at her closely and said, "You're different now." Fiona nodded, understanding what she meant. I finally believe I belong to myself, she replied. Not to their expectations, not to their approval, just me. Back home that evening, she lit a candle and wrote in her journal. She didn't write about pain anymore. Not because it was gone, but because it no longer led the story. Instead, she wrote about the small things, the way the barista at the coffee shop remembered her name, the way her tomato plants had started blooming again, the way she no longer flinched when she heard unexpected knocks at the door. She wrote about freedom. Not the kind you buy, but the kind you reclaim. And as the day turned to dusk, Fiona sat on her porch swing, sipping the last of her tea, wrapped in a blanket of quiet pride. She had not won by shouting louder or giving more. She had won by choosing herself every single day in a world that once taught her she wasn't enough, and that she thought was the richest ending of all.